Sunday school leaders, I'm going to start off this prep talk with an apology. It could be that last week when you started watching the prep talk, it didn't have the opening as it usually does, and it started with me kind of standing there, adjusting my hair and all this. And hopefully if you saw that, you watched the other one. What happened is I uploaded my unedited version, and anyway, sorry about that. Hopefully I won't do that again. So anyway, let's look and see what is going on this week. Remember, we started the unit last week. It's entitled Broken Vessels, How God Uses Imperfect People. We're in week 2, and this session is called Objections, Overruled. We're looking at some select verses out of Exodus chapters 3 and 4, and the point of the lesson is that God will work through us despite our shortcomings. The good thing about having that video that I did last week unedited and uploaded it, it was an excellent example for me to use in Sunday school class to show how God uses imperfect people, and when we fail and fail miserably, God can still use us. So anyway, hopefully the class got a good laugh out of that. Hopefully you did too. Anyway, we're going to look ahead here. It's amazing that God continues to use imperfect people. We think about people like Moses and David and Elijah and Saul or Paul, and to do his work. And we oftentimes will look at these biblical heroes as like biblical X-Men. We'll put them up on that pedestal that there's something we could never, ever attain. I saw a video this last week about that Francis Chan was teaching, and he talked about this and how in James 5:17, one of his favorite verses, where he says that Elijah was a man just like us. You know, this is a guy that called fire down from heaven, and Elijah was just an ordinary man, just like David, Moses, Saul, or Paul, you and me, an ordinary human being that God can use. He can call the ordinary to do extraordinary things through his power and through his strength. Now, our lesson this week is on Moses. As I said, we're in Exodus chapter 3 and 4. If you'd like to pepper your lessons with a little trivia, you might ask if anybody remembers who Moses' wife was. The first name that comes to mind is Miriam. Of course, we know that's Moses' sister, but it's Zipporah. Zipporah was Moses' wife. So anyway, I like to throw in a little extra trivia in my lessons just to make it a little interesting. So the story this week takes place at the burning bush. But let's go back and look at seeing what happened before this. 80 years before this burning bush episode, we have Moses being born, raised in Pharaoh's court. Now, toward the end of that first 40 years of his life, Moses sees an Egyptian beating on a Hebrew slave. Moses is a Hebrew himself. He sees this and kills that Egyptian. He then runs out to the desert, spends 40 years out in the desert, marries a woman, Zipporah, and tends to Jethro and tends to his flocks. Now, at the end of that 40 years, that's where we are now, that 80 years into his life. So he's at age 80 when this burning bush episode happens. Now, just before today's text, God himself is speaking through the bush, and he says, I've seen the misery of my people in Egypt, and I've come to rescue them. And in verse 10 of chapter 3, God says, I'm sending you, Moses. I'm sending you to help the Israelites get out of Egypt. And so this is where we pick up our story today. Now, Moses had 5 objections to this call that God had on his life and for the plan of his life. And we look at objection number 1, and it says in chapter 3, verse 11, Moses says, who am I? You know, I'm a Hebrew. I killed an Egyptian. I'm 80 years old. Now, he didn't say all those things, but that's probably what's going through his head. Who am I to do this? All these things, my race, my past actions, my age. Who am I to do this tremendous feat that you've called me to, God? Can you relate to that? Can you relate to those objections? Can your Sunday school class members relate to that? I bet they can. Now, God overrules that objection in verse 12 when he says, I will be with you. You know, that reminds me of Romans chapter 8, verse 12 that says, if God is for us, who can be against us? If God's called us to a task and he's on our side, it doesn't matter what our inabilities are. We're going to be successful through him. God's going to be successful. And then God gives Moses a sign, but it's a sign that he will see in the future. It's a future sign. He said, here's a sign to you. meaning you all, it's a plural you all will worship me on this mountain that we're on right now. When that comes to pass, you'll know these things, I've enabled you to do these things. Now, there's a couple of objections that aren't in our text that LifeWay has laid out for us. I'm going to go ahead and speak to those, address those, and read those. But it gives the full force of the lengths that Moses went to try to escape God's call. So we look at objection 2. There again, this is not in the LifeWay text. But in chapter 3, verse 13, Moses says, well, what if the Israelites ask your name? Who am I say, what's your name? Who am I to say sent me? Moses is basically saying, okay, you say you're going to go with me, but they may not believe it. So if I show up and take charge, they're going to want to know who sent me. Under whose authority am I being sent under? God overrules that objection. He says, I am that I am. I am who I am. That's my name. That's who sent you. I am. And not only that, here's another sign for the future. Here's another future sign. I'm going to send signs, plagues, wonders to the people of Egypt and to Israel to show them, to show both sides that I am who I am. And not only that, when you leave, you're going to be able to plunder the Egyptians. Your people are living as slaves now, but when they leave the land, they're going to be able to go to their Egyptian neighbors and ask them for silver, and they will gladly give it to them to get them out of the country. Another future sign. So as we think about us in this objection, what if, if we think God maybe has called us to a task, but we try to get out of it. We say, what if the church or the Sunday school class or the committee or the people in the business meeting says, what gives you the right to come in here and do this? Okay, we have these same objections, don't we? We get down to objection number 3. There again, it's not in the text as well. It says, what if they don't believe me? I tell them all these things and they still don't believe me. God replied immediately with some signs right then and there. For Moses, the sign was for right now, but it was also a precursor. It was a foreshadowing of signs of plagues that would happen to the Egyptians. There was the throwing down the staff, right? It turned into a snake. Moses picks it up by the tail, which is very dangerous if you're going to pick up a snake. Then there was the putting your hand inside the cloak and pulling it out, and it's leprous. And then he puts it back in, and it's healed. It's completely back to normal. Then there's a future sign as well. It says you can take some water from the Nile and pour it out before the king, and when you do, that water will turn to blood. Of course, that's a foreshadowing of the Nile turning to blood, isn't it? We get down to objection 4. We're back to our text now. Objection 4. This is chapter 4, verse 10. Moses says, I'm just not a good speaker, right? We don't know if he's a stutterer, if he's got a lisp, if he's got some other kind of speech impediment, if he's just slow in thinking and talking, which if you watch my unedited video last week, you'll see that I have that same problem. We're not sure exactly what that was, but there was some issue with his speech. And Moses says, but I can't. I'm not a good speaker. And God overrules that objection. He says, who made the mouth? I did. I'm the creator. I made you. Am I unaware of this? I'm calling you. I made you. I know your imperfections, and I'm still calling you to do that. Now, go and speak the words that I'm going to tell you. Well, that takes us to the last objection that Moses had. In chapter 4, verse 13, he refuses. Although it's a polite refusal, he says, please send someone else to do this. Isaiah said, here am I, send me. Moses said, here am I, send someone else, right? And the Bible tells us at this, the Lord's anger burned against Moses. The Lord had been pretty patient up to this point. He says, okay, I'm going to send somebody else to speak, but you're still going. I'll speak to you, you speak to Aaron, and then Aaron will be your spokesman. But you will still carry the staff, and you will still perform the miraculous signs that I've instructed you to do. So here's some takeaways, I think, from the lesson. First of all, self-criticism is not humility. In fact, when we criticize ourselves, we're criticizing the Creator. let's take an example here. Here's a stapler. Now, if this stapler is defective and it won't do its job, who do we blame? Do we blame the stapler? Do we punish the stapler and put the stapler in timeout? What do we do? Well, no, we criticize the creator, the manufacturer. It's a manufacturing defect. So when I say, I'm not smart enough to do that, I'm not a good enough speaker, I'm unworthy, we're not. Sometimes we'll think of that as humility, but actually what we're doing is we're saying, God, you created me. I know you've called me to this task, but you didn't create me well enough, good enough to be able to do the task you've called me to. Another takeaway is that if you think you're not worthy to do something that God's called you to do, you're absolutely correct. You're not worthy. Okay, I know when I've asked people to teach Sunday school, or I've been on committees that ask people if they would consider being deacons, and usually one of the first replies is, I'm just not good enough. I'm just not worthy. And I immediately say, you are exactly right. You are not worthy. I'm glad we got that out of the way. Now let's move on from there. Also, don't miss out on the blessing that God has for you. You know, Moses was blessed tremendously. I think he'd have been blessed even more if he would obeyed initially instead of getting Aaron to be part of the deal. Also, and you've heard this time and time again, but availability trumps ability. God doesn't call the equipped. He equips the called. We've heard that. We've heard that in Sunday school. We've heard that in sermons. We've seen it on bumper stickers and church signs, but it's true. God doesn't call the equipped. He equips the called. Also, God's strength is more evident in our weakness than in our natural ability. If I am a natural great public speaker and I preach and people are saying that's great, but it can come back to me, oh, Jim's such a good speaker. Listen to how well he speaks. But if there's somebody like Moses that stumbles around, fumbles around, and people come to the Lord, it's evident that it's the Lord's working. It is not a natural ability. You know, it said that Jonathan Edwards, one of the great preachers a couple of centuries ago, he read his manuscript. He read his manuscript like this, and he would read it, and he wasn't very he wasn't a very powerful or forceful, emotional reader. And people were so convicted that they were holding on to the backs of the pews for the fear that they would die and slip into hell. So that was the power of God being evident in the inability of a human. So I hope this gives you a little bit of insight, a little additional insight about this week's lesson, maybe some ideas, maybe a different direction or whatever to take your lesson this week. Next week we'll be looking at the gift of grace and how God is very graceful with us as he continues to use us, broken vessels, for his service. So thanks for watching this week. Hopefully I will upload the edited version